This is a discussion of the Islamic world, also known as Dar al-Islam, over the course of the late Middle Ages. Let's start this off with a little background. The Prophet Muhammad climbed a mountain, talked to God, wrote a book, conquered all of Arabia, and then died. Everybody tried to pick a successor, couldn't agree, and they decided to agree to disagree, which is why Islam is split into the Sunni and the Shia. So that's the context, now we can talk about the actual thing. You know how they say that there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes? Well, that's wrong, because there's a third certainty, and that's horse nomads. The Middle East suffered two game-changing nomadic invasions from the East in just 300 years. The first were the Seljuk Turks, who were Sunni Muslim, but that didn't stop them from wrecking everybody's shop, including, notably, the Byzantines. The leader of the Seljuks called himself the Sultan, which is important because it made the Abbasid Caliph look less important. They're basically the reason Turkish people exist in the Middle East. Of course, this created a whole host of problems, not least of which was the Crusades. That's a whole can of worms which I will leave firmly sealed for now. All you need to know is that they failed to take Jerusalem until the Fourth Crusade, which would have gone really well if their goal was to conquer Constantinople. So, oops, Byzantium fell apart, but it'll get better. Then they tried and failed again, a couple of times. Just a couple. Over the course of many years, the Seljuks would eventually dwindle in power until all that was left was the small and relatively unimpressive Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia. The second, and arguably more impactful, nomadic invasion was the definitive horse nomad invasion, the Mongols. They came out of nowhere in 1258 and cleaned house of pretty much everybody. They demolished the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ayyubid Sultanate, and the Sultanate of Rum. They finally got stopped in Egypt by the Mamluks, a sultanate of former slaves bought mostly from Central Asia, who would also host the pathetic excuse for the Abbasid throne for a couple of centuries. Anyway, there was a lot of culture stuff going on around this time. Before the Mongols ruined everything, Islamic scholars were going around and questing for knowledge all over the place, bringing it back to the Baghdad House of Wisdom, which was so wise that the Mongols couldn't handle it and had to burn it down. While it lasted, they translated Greek classics into Arabic, which pretty much saved them from the abyss of historical irrelevancy. They did a lot of math, and are the reason Arabic numerals are called that, even though they were invented in India, and they made paper, and they taught the Europeans how to do that. Come to think of it, they did a lot of translating, but they also did a lot of science and philosophy of their own. For example, a guy called Nasir al-Din al-Tusi did a bunch of really important stuff. He had a really cool observatory and made really accurate star charts, which I am very thankful for, and he basically invented trigonometry as a separate subject, which I am not as much thankful for. He also made medical advances and did a bunch of philosophy. Another guy called Ibn Khaldun was basically a founder of sociology, which means I'll have him to thank when I take that class this summer. A woman named Aisha al-Bayunia, of whom no pictures exist regretfully, was a really prominent poet and, apart from having too many apostrophes in her name, was also a Sufi. Sufism emphasized introspection over the study that a lot of other Muslims did, which is why it produced fewer scholars and more artists than other branches of Islam, and its missionaries were a huge help in spreading the religion all over the place. This poet in particular mostly chronicled her personal journey through the spiritual world and her connections to the poets that came before her. Of course, you can't build a whole society on just smart people because you need money. Dar al-Islam had a lot of that. Since the main man Muhammad himself had been a merchant, the religion was very encouraging to traders and salesfolk. A lot of expansion was done through tried-and-true method of discounts that were offered to people who converted. I see marketing strategies haven't much changed. This helped spread the religion to East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The Mongols played a big part in reviving the Silk Roads, which Muslim traders took advantage of to the fullest. This combined with their traditional bathtub of the Indian Ocean made the Islamic world fabulously wealthy. From these places they brought back textiles, porcelain, ivory, spices, gold, and... oh yeah, slaves. That was a thing that existed. Muslims were not allowed to be enslaved, as were Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, which meant that many slaves converted, so they had to be set free. Most slaves were bought from Africa, the Kievan Rus, and Central Asia. Slave women, although they mostly served as concubines, were paradoxically more free than married women in some cases, as they were permitted to do things like go out in public alone and dance in front of other men. These practices are restrictive and borderline abhorrent by our modern sensibilities, but they were actually kind of progressive by medieval standards. Islamic women were generally better off than their Christian or Jewish contemporaries. They could inherit property and retain their property after marriage, They could remarry if widowed, receive a monetary divorce settlement, and even initiate divorce in some cases. They could practice birth control and were protected from retaliation if they testified in a court, even though their testimony was only worth half of a man's. Of course, we have no idea how they actually felt about this, as Islamic history was written by almost exclusively men until around 1450. However, rights would wane over time as new cities brought new customs and new restrictions. With that sober and depressingly relevant topic out of the way, let's hop over to the Mediterranean and talk about Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was conquered by the Umayyads from 711 to around 788 and was henceforth called Al-Andalus. It may have taken that long to seize total control, but the advance pretty much stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732, in which the man with the most awesome name ever, Charles the Hammer Martel, successfully brought the hammer down on the Umayyads' butts and drove them out of Francia. Fortunately for everyone involved, the Umayyads decided that just Spain was fine, and they didn't need to go any further. Cordoba was made the capital, and it became arguably one of the coolest places in all of Eurasia. There was so much wisdom and chillness in Iberia that it was one of the only places in Europe where you could see all three major Abrahamic religions exist without constantly trying to murder each other. Christian kingdoms and Muslim caliphates bordering without conflict? Preposterous. At least, that was the case until the Christians said that they wanted it all back and reconquisted it. Because of this peaceful coexistence, a ton of cultural exchange went down. Philosophers copied each other's homework in a long chain of inspiration that included such household names as Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Most of the translated classical works and math stuff was transferred to Europe through Spain. This kind of cultural exchange, which occurred all over the Islamic world, laid the foundations for major change in European society. You know the Renaissance? The time all of Southern Europe collectively decided that they really liked Greece? Yeah, that was mostly because of the classics being translated by Islamic scholars. Europe may not have gotten access to paper either, which would have been quite a shame because then I wouldn't have been able to use it for my background. Or, Allah forbid, Arabic numerals may have been called Indian numerals. Other very important things would have been passed through Dar al-Islam to Europe over the course of history, such as guns, paper currency, and the bubonic plague. That last one isn't so great, but hey, it's topical. That was the history and background of the Islamic world in a fairly limited time frame. So long, wash your hands, and stay hydrated.